And welcome to the Systems Innovation Melbourne Hub event. I'm very excited because this is our first event and I'm the Melbourne Hub representative, and even more so because it's our first Australian event. And we have three excellent panelists tonight that we can get their insights and perspectives on systems thinking. And I won't define systems thinking myself. As part of the sort of panel discussion, I'll hand that over to the panelists to provide their different perspectives. And indeed, it's okay if we do have different perspectives because systems thinking is one of those things at the moment, right? So thank you all for joining us. We've had an excellent response to this, both through LinkedIn and also through the System Innovation site itself. We've got a number of participants joining us, which is great. And you'll each have an opportunity to contribute through the chat. So please do that throughout. The format for tonight is we've got about 3 or 4 questions for each of the panelists, and we'll take about 45 minutes to go through those. And I'll go through each of the panelists with the questions. And please, contribute as you see fit throughout. Because at the end, as I said, we'll probably come back to a 10 or 15 minute session at the end where Joss and I will select some of the participant questions and put them back to the panel or to an individual if they were directed in such a manner. The session's recorded, so you'll be able to view it later as well. Please think about that, and we'll also put the panelists' details on that at the end of that recording, so that if you want to reach out to them directly, then you can do that, and indeed they can put their information up on the chat as we go through today. So, system thinking. It's interestingly, it seems to have got a bit of a peak here in Australia. I'm not sure what is happening globally, but around a lot of the societal and what they term the wicked problems, systems thinking tends to come into play, and there's a lot of different perspectives on it, and we'll start to address those this evening. The panelists that we have this evening, I'll do a very brief introduction to. I won't go through their summaries because they can do that themselves, but we have Delia Pembrey MacNamara, who's the president of the International Society for Systems Sciences, and she's coming to us from Canberra. We have Ray Ison, who's a professor of systems at the UK Open University, and he's actually currently based out of Melbourne due to COVID, but is usually in the UK. Thank you, Ray, for your time as well. And we have Seanna Davidson, who's the director of the Systems School, also here in Melbourne. And that's a thing that you might want to look up, and I'm sure Seanna will share some of what they're doing through the Systems School as part of the introduction. So that's about it from me in terms of introduction. I'll just go through some of the questions that we've got, and I'll hand over to the panelists. And the first question is to tell us about yourself and your journey to systems thinking. So it's a bit of an introduction of you to everyone that's joined us this evening, and how you've come to the space of systems thinking and being on this panel ultimately. So perhaps, Dee, if we start with you, if that's okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm on my mobile phone. So what I wanted to say was that for me, systems thinking, we could define it, but one of the things that I find useful is that thinking is about inquiring. It's sort of like learning, it gives me the opportunity to become a translator. So when I can systems think and understand people, I can ask questions and understand how other people think. My understanding is that majority of people actually think in systems, and it's about understanding how they think in systems. And myself as a systems thinker, it's actually my role to find out how they think, so that we can then communicate across boundaries. So that's my, well, it's not a definition, it's more of an action.
No, excellent. And how did you come across it in the first place?
Across systems thinking?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I started off with an information systems degree a long time ago, and that's when I first got introduced to systems thinking, and that was to do with technical systems and understanding information systems in large. Well, I was in the Royal Australian Navy, so it was looking at those large infrastructure, wide area networks. So that's how I actually came into systems thinking. Originally, but further on in my career, I was working within social media, and then started my PhD, and then that's when we really started to go into the theory and the philosophy of systems thinking, not just the practice.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Dee. Ray, tell us a bit about yourself and your journey to systems thinking, please.
Thanks, Imre. Good evening, everyone. Nice to have you here. Well, I grew up on a farm in rural New South Wales, and anyone who comes from a rural background knows that you've got to play with the relationships between people, plants, soils, animals, markets, and all of those sorts of things. And if they don't create a reasonable relationship in certain sorts of ways, then you don't find yourself farming for long. So I was a systems thinker before I knew anything about the word systems, really. And if I then jump forward from those experiences of growing up in rural New South Wales to joining the Open University in the UK 27 years ago in a group that's been teaching systems thinking courses and developing material for 50 years now. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. What we discover from looking at our students who've studied all those modules and courses we've presented over the years is that many people were like me who didn't know they were systems thinkers, but actually thought systemically. They thought profoundly in terms of relationship and how relationship was pivotal to a whole set of dynamics and unfolding events. And so when they came to our modules and studied them formally, they were greatly relieved to think that there was actually this area of study called systems thinking, and that they actually, the way they thought about the world was a genuine way to think about the world rather than something that they hid a bit to themselves, particularly during the 70s and 80s when the concept system only tended to refer to a computer. For another group of our students, the idea of systems thinking was a great aha moment. It made people aware that they could actually take responsibility for thinking about their own thinking, and they could think differently to the way they currently thought, if they so chose to do. And for another group of students, the idea that you should change the way you think about the world was terribly confronting, often made people angry and uncomfortable. And so based on those experiences, I've come to view these phases as, and make the claim that we humans are born with a systemic sensibility. The young mammal is born into relationship, but what happens in our culture and our education system is that we have a lot of that driven out of us. We move from being systemic into what I call systematic, thinking in linear cause effect things, that A causes B, and that control and command can cause all sorts of things to happen. Now, what happens if you move beyond and recover your systemic literacy, your systems literacy? Well, you need to invest in, sorry, let me start that sentence again. What happens if you want to move beyond recovering your systemic sensibility? Well, you've got to invest in systems literacy. There is actually a vast area of scholarship, understanding concepts which can be used and put into methods and practical application to do something systemically. And the way to do that is to go beyond just literacy and being aware of it to what we call systems thinking and practice capability. You've got to have the capability to put these ideas into action. And perhaps in a later question, I can come back to say something about, well, where are those actions today? Why don't we have those actions, and what do we need to do about it? So I'll stop there, Emma.
Excellent. Thank you, Ray. You've certainly covered a lot of ground there, and coming from the farming start makes a lot of sense to me as well. I grew up in a similar fashion, so thank you for that. Seanna, tell us a bit about yourself and your journey on the systems thinking.
Yeah, thank you. Really pleasure to be here. And as a systems nerd through and through, it's great to see such interest in the conversation this evening. I'm a Canadian, immigrated to Australia in 2015. So my feet are currently placed on the land of the water-wearing people. My journey to systems thinking, I think I'm very much the person that Ray was speaking about just moments ago. I was trained originally as a geographer, so thinking in terms of patterns and relationships was very much a frame of thinking for me way back in high school. I had a high school teacher who was really just a phenomenal geographer, and so that was really present in my thinking. I think my parents would also offer that I've always been a critical thinker. I really love teasing things apart, asking questions, trying to make sense of. And as a young person, that probably came across a bit more as debate than good generative dialogue. But those skills, I think, have really served me well. And so as I began my career, I was really interested in issues of access to freshwater resources. What did it mean to decide that resources belong to one country? Because I grew up in Canada and the Great Lakes with this wealth of water resources. But as someone who considered myself a global citizen, the boundaries of that decision, meaning that people in other countries, other nations that were experiencing water scarcity, for example, didn't get access to that water. And it just really got me into processes of decision-making, stakeholder consultation, all of that kind of work. And as I did that work for many years, I became really frustrated that so often we focused on the problem. We didn't really have effective processes to engage people in generative dialogue once we got them in the room. So often the goal was just to get people in the room. And we didn't really know what to do with them once they were all there, to make sense of the system, to find our way through the complexity that we were all sitting with. And I was really fortunate later in my academic career to work with some fantastic systems scholars. And that started off for me at the University of Waterloo with a program in innovation and some really skilled thinkers in the Canadian innovation space. And then I came over to Australia to work with Ray and had that very fortunate opportunity to learn from him. And I think one of the biggest things that I took away from working with Ray that was in contrast to my earlier exposure to systems thinking was this element of practice. And what does that actually mean for the individual practitioner and our influence on the systems that we're engaging in, whether that be leading practices and methodologies or our own role that we have in the system that we play in. And that's really become fundamental to the kind of work that I do now at the Systems School, where we focus on building capacity in others to think and act and engage in a system in places of complexity, whether that be at the individual level or in teams or collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seanna. That's a lot of ground as well, and very interesting that you've come from almost a natural environment perspective as well, from the system side of things. So that's great. All right, well, that's a really good base for us to start. And thank you so much for sharing those baseline perspectives. My second question, and we won't start with Dee this time. We had a pre-discussion on this, and Dee said that this is a horrible question. So perhaps we'll go to Ray on this one as a starting point, and Dee, I'll leave you to third, and then we'll go to Sean. Come back to you, Sean, if that's all right. So the second question is, and I think this is part of the challenge that Ray was alluding to before, but how would you explain systems thinking to someone who knows nothing about it? Ray?
Well, thank you for the question. Of course, the answer to that is always contextual, and it depends who I'm having the conversation with. What I would prefer to do is, in dialogue with you, explore some aspects of your past experience and try and draw into the conversation some aspect that might elucidate how systems thinking operates or what it is. As most of you are based in Australia, one might like to reflect, and I would argue that reflection is a key aspect of it, on the recent vaccination, well, I'll call it a debacle here in Australia. And to think about, well, if you were to think about a system to vaccinate over 50-year-olds in Australia in a equitable, rapid and other manner, what sort of things would you have to do to create such a system with such a purpose? And so the idea of system is how you bring different elements and practices together in relation to purpose, it seems to me, as a critical sort of starting point for how we might understand systems. I might also say that in everyday language, we use the word system quite a lot. I claim it's gone feral and it doesn't get used terribly well or very intellectually, if you like. And a lot of what we talk about when we talk about the system or system failure actually is the absence of system. And so what we're still striving to do in Australia is to produce a viable system to achieve vaccination. And we could go further than the Australian model as well, where it's interesting that they've brought in a logistics person from the military, from the Navy, to try and get some of the elements of the system into place. But there's clearly a contestation over the real purpose and the real raison d'etre for the system, even though what is espoused may seem often common. But I'm not going to explore that. But if you just reflect on what has or hasn't happened and what people are trying to do there, well, then you'll get the idea about getting relationships together, getting things operational to achieve a purpose which is effective. There are two key words that I use in relation to a system, which I think are important. One is effectiveness. Does it achieve its purpose? And efficacy. Does it work? And so the vaccination one has to work if it's to be effective. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ray. It's my journey to here has been through process improvement and process thinking, which you elaborate that out to systems thinking, and an observation and a frustration reflecting on what you said about COVID is quite often the government talks about systemic failure. So the word system gets used almost in a way of avoiding accountability because it wasn't anyone's fault, it was the system's fault. And yet they don't manage the system. So anyway, that's my association with exactly what you've just said. So thank you,
I agree with you totally.
So it's the only way it's come into the parlance, unfortunately, but we'll get there. We'll make that change. Seanna, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you. And I understand you're going to share your screen as to assist in answering this question.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I'm being a bit sneaky, but I just realized this is probably one of the easiest ways. So I actually love this question. I think it's a really valuable one. And as others have already kind of alluded to, there's, of course, quite a broad landscape of ways to think in systems, disciplines that have informed both systems thinking and that draw on systems thinking. And it's a way that I approach much of the teaching that I do is to help to really situate myself in that landscape so that as I'm teaching you, but as individual participants continue in their own systems journey, as they're reading, as they're listening, as they're learning from others, they can help understand and appreciate where each of those folks are situated in the systems thinking landscape. So how I talk about systems thinking in terms of how is it useful and what is it, in the first instance, I like to say that systems thinking is a way to help us to make sense of complexity. I have an image that I often use, which is someone diving into a deep kind of black hole almost. Because in complexity, we know that there is so much uncertainty, so much ambiguity, things that can't even be known. And so systems thinking is a way for us to make sense of that, a way for us to find our way through. Well, if we want to get a little bit more detailed, I'm just going to share this with you now. This is what I use to help communicate to others what happens when we're thinking in systems. And in this visual that I'm sharing with you, there's these large circles, and much like we have nested systems, I use this to kind of conceive of nesting bowls. And so for me, in the largest bowl, in terms of everything that we're doing in thinking of systems, we're doing that systems practice. So I've started to speak to that a moment ago, and it's a big part of Ray's work as well, which is, as the individual practitioner, how are we mindful of our own biases, our own assumptions, our mental models that are fundamentally shaping and either limiting or widening our ability to see and understand the system. And so everything that we do needs to start there. In the next instance, we've got systems language, which is really critical because it helps us to communicate, to convey to others the specific phenomena in which we are trying to draw our attention to when doing systems thinking. And so I refer to that as the 4 lenses, which we've got in the sense-making model, which sits in this most interior nesting bowl, if you will. So that phenomena that we're looking at the most general, most abstract level is about relationships, boundaries, perspectives, and dynamics. And you heard Ray speaking to that, a little bit of that as well. So in the simplest way, if we're looking to any one or more of those 4 things, we're trying to think about and engage in the system. So the system's language helps us to describe that phenomena, that communicate that phenomena to others. And ultimately, though, everything that we're doing in systems is a sense-making process. We're trying to understand what is it that's happening around us, both to acknowledge what's here and also to, of course, find our way through, and in that very adaptive and iterative learning way. So in systems thinking, we, of course, have very well-established methodologies that we use, tools and methods. We also have ones that are continuing to emerge that are often adapted and revised on the fly in order to meet the context in which we're in. We use those tools and methods to explore those 4 lenses: perspectives, boundaries, relationships, and dynamics, in order that we might be able to see and understand the system. And so to me, when I try and introduce people to this notion of thinking in systems, thinking systemically, this is what we're doing when we do what we do. And so I'll pause there and let's come from a slide deck. So stop sharing and turn the mic back.
Thank you very much. And I really like the 4 lenses, and the way that you explain the levels really works for me. So thank you very much. And I'm sure that the participants would have got value out of that. Now, Dee, it's interested in your views about how you would explain systems thinking to someone who knows nothing about it on the back of those 2.
Okay, so for myself, when I speak to people about systems thinking, I often get the question, I often get the answer of people saying, well, what is systems thinking? And then when I try to explain, oh, well, first of all, tell me about yourself now, and tell me about the systems that where you work in. And I've got to admit that I have been heavily influenced by Ray Ison and his work in systemic inquiry. So and really recognizing that when we think about systems, and my supervisor for my PhD is Gerald Midgley. And in one of his, and in his book, Systemic Intervention, he actually, poses a question, and he says, perhaps the boundary is key. And that's something that, in systems, we talk about the boundary, that a boundary is, a system is defined by its boundary. But I work in networks. So where does the boundary exist when you're talking about a network? And so that was and that's where I started to realize, I'm going to tie in with Seanna's, that you have to sort of understand that dialogue of, have that dialogue with people to first of all, understand where are they coming from, what is their concept, and as a systems thinker, you can understand, you can translate what is an input, what is an output, what are those processes, where are the boundaries. That's the very simple component. Okay, so that's a really good starting point. And then from there, we start to talk about, well, how does that relate to this? How does it relate to that? Is there an interdependency? Is there an interrelationship there? And I work in, very large complex systems, in terms of IT, not just IT, but also policy and legislation. So you've got like a whole multiplex of systems interacting with one another, and all of them are speaking a language. And it's about being able to, I would say that systems thinking, I would explain that that systems thinking actually facilitates a language to communicate across these boundaries, to first of all identify the boundary, and then to be able to communicate across them, so that we can actually work together to get to achieving a particular purpose. So that's. And I'm keeping it quite simple. I mean, there's a lot more to that, but we also find that within that boundary layer, that's where also we see where quite a lot of the problems arise. We have opportunities there to emancipate, and that's where the ethics comes into it. But it's also where we end up, if the boundary is too hard, we actually find that you can start to marginalize, exclude. And have all these other systemic impacts that you might not have originally intended for. So yes, that's how I explain systems thinking to people. Or I try not to.
No, thank you very much, and I think that's very respectful and responsible, and as you say, aligned with Ray's approach in terms of the inquiry, and in some ways aligned to what Seanna said in terms of understanding the other person's or people's perspective from which they're coming from, to have a particular response. And something in common with all three of your responses and within Seanna's diagram was the concept of systems practice. And in fact, one of the dilemmas for me is when people talk about systems thinking, it always can get quite convoluted, and people say, but what about the practice? What about the outcome? What are you going to achieve from this? So I guess that leads me to my third question, and perhaps we'll go to Ray on this, is how do you think systems thinking can translate into enabling us to make the needed changes for our organisations and our society in general? So how do we translate the thinking into practice, basically? And we've touched on this a little bit. Ray alluded to the problems that we had through COVID, but how would you respond to that, Ray?
Thank you for the question. I hope you're all going okay with this conversation. If I go back to the systemic sensibility, systems literacy, systems thinking and practice capability distinctions, then the simple answer, although it's by far not at all simple, would be that we need, as a species, to recover our systemic sensibilities. But unfortunately, we live in a society, or many societies, where recovering those systemic sensibilities is not easy. We need a significant investment in building systems literacy, and that is engaging with the ideas, the concepts, the scholarship, the other things that underpin the sorts of things that Dee and Seanna and I are saying, and others say as well, but where you can hardly find many major programs. There are certainly not many major programs in universities around the world, or in, but there are burgeoning labs, think tanks, NGOs like this group, Systems Innovation. So invest in literacy is, I think, a really critical issue. But above all, we've got to try to put it into practice. Now, unfortunately, putting it into practice requires just that. It requires places to experiment, places to fail, but it also requires us to be very critically aware of the rules that we humans have invented, what some institutional economists call institutions, the rules that make it difficult to think and act systemically, because many of the rules are made up to favour the other modes of thinking. And so unless we can create milieus and contexts in which those our practice and our doings can thrive, then we're likely to find we've invested a lot of effort and not succeeded. And so that is in a way the great challenge of the post-COVID Anthropocene that we're now entering.
Very clear and very succinct, Ray. Thank you for that. Those rules that we've invented that are wrong, absolutely. Seanna, how would you answer that question about how do we translate systems thinking into enabling us to have some impact and positive change on society and organisations in general? Seanna?
Sorry, I thought you said D. I just misheard. Apologies. Gosh, I think I come at this in a really pragmatic way, because I think for so long, for me, the program that I worked with in Canada at Waterloo, it was so theoretical, so conceptual, and it was like all of that was really making sense to me, and I just didn't understand, how does this happen on the ground? And I got really frustrated by that. And when I met Ray, I was like, thank the Lord. Here's what you do on the ground, right? And so from that point forward for me, I have put, gosh, almost all my energy in making the tools, methods, and practices as clear, as accessible to people as possible, so that you can't say to me, I don't know what to do, because I'm going to make sure that what tools to use, when you use them, what they're going to give you as an outcome, how they're going to help you to achieve or move through the barrier that you're experiencing right now in the system, whether it be in your team or your collaboration or across the system or across sectors. That to me shouldn't be one of the barriers. And so I focus all my efforts on really helping people to understand, like, what are these methods and tools that are available to use, and how do you actually use this? And so that's literally what I spend my time doing, is essentially documenting those, making those available to others, and then coaching them to get familiar with them, because it comes back to that practice. Like, none of this stuff comes off the shelf. You know, it's not off the shelf training that you do it once and you're an expert in it. It is very much about that practice. And so I say to people that in order for this to be useful, for this to be an applied practice, it's about returning to it regularly and using these things consistently. And so the short answer is that we actually just have to do this stuff. I don't think that it's a barrier to what do I do or how do I do this. We're now really making those sorts of things available. It's about the shifting practice to make time and space in the ways that we work, which is essentially a shift in our culture of learning, our way of doing. And so that also comes along with a shift in values and beliefs about how we should be operating in the world. It comes with a shift in terms of the time scale in which we conceive that change can take place. And so to me, I think fundamentally, again, it's that practice of actually doing. The stuff is out there. It's not hard to do. It's about the commitment to actually engaging with it on a daily or weekly practice, or look, as Ray said, again, that's those spaces to actually experiment, to try out, to practice. And when we think about that at society at large, so I was sitting with this as a question, and something that's really been present for me that I'm exploring with a couple of colleagues right now is systems leadership. And what does that mean and what does that look like? So I think there's a scale nature to that question that you've asked, and that the changes that we need to enable are not only at the individual or team or kind of organizational level, but our whole conception of what it means to lead change in a system. And probably fundamental to that is that change in the system isn't about an actor or an organization. It's about this distributed nature of change, distributed nature of actions which are helping us to achieve the goal, the change in the systems goal that we have. So we're moving from the purpose that we have right now, which is usually at odds with the values and beliefs that we're holding. That's why we want it to change, to that future purpose that we're oriented to. And so I think there's a big shift in terms of culture and beliefs as well about how that change comes about, and that it is this distributed. There's a lot of servant leadership characteristics in it as well. Folks stepping up who are not traditionally seen or acknowledged as leaders, but who have unique and valuable skills that are required, that are needed at the time, that are matching with the system's needs in terms of the change and the process of change that we're trying to bring about. So I think that really at the end of the day, it's about the practice of returning to what it means to think systemically, actually applying these tools and practices which are there, they're available to us, and also valuing this way of working. And that is what is going to enable us to work and think this way more broadly and to bring about the changes that we're seeking.
Thank you, Seanna. Delia, how would you see that we can translate the systems thinking into having positive impact on society? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I thought I could use the space bar. It won't let me do it. So thank you. Right. How do I think systems thinking can translate into enabling us to make needed changes in our organisations and society? Okay, the framework I tend to use, which actually helps me in my workplace, is Mike C. Jackson's systems of systems methodologies, where he's looking, and you can start to see, hard systems thinking, where we see the world as a very objective. You've got bits and widgets and things like that. That's where the engineers, you could probably fit the engineers there, machine learning as well, because I'm going to go into the data space. And then you've got the soft systems thinking, which is talking more about, people and the cognitive systems, how they're actually thinking. And then we've got the complex and the chaotic. Now, how does that translate? And I think it's really important for me, that's how I tend, if we're going to be utilizing systems thinking, the thinking is actually done in our heads and everyone is doing the thinking. But what we really need to do is translate that into a dialogue. And we need to understand where people, not just where I situate with myself, it's actually where others situate themselves as well in the bigger picture. So that's how, in terms of translating that into making much needed changes, when we, first of all, I have to understand where they're at. But then the other thing we need to understand is how do we, what I've learned through my systems thinking experience is it is about the human experience. And it's about how it systemically affects others and how it affects others, not just in the immediate future, but also in 30 years from now. And I think that when we have a look at the system like that, we actually really realize that when we are in a group of people who come from different disciplines, who are all working in a different functional area, we need to have a look at not just what we're trying to do or what the purpose is, but is it going to be ethical? what's the outcome going to be? Not just in the immediate future, tick in the box. How's it going to be 30 years down from now? And we need to appreciate that people that there is a diversity of people who think in different ways, and they are all to be appreciated, even from the hard systems thinkers all the way through to the complexity thinkers. Because sometimes the hard systems thinkers can't think complexity. That's just not, it's just not their thing, and that's not, but they can appreciate it, but they don't want to do it. And that's fully, and that's good. That's actually a good thing, because we do need our hard systems thinkers in order to get, those tangible products out there. But we also need to have our complexity thinkers to be able to navigate that, multiple futures and multiple human activities that we have, from the political, environmental, social, technological, economic, that whole spectrum. So, but I do feel that that the more one delves into systems thinking and opens it up and goes and understands systems literacy, one actually almost gets an internal sense of what's right and what's wrong, and how to move together towards a good future.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. There's a fair bit of content in what you've shared with us, and there's the transdisciplinarity of it, I think, is part of that. But I like the way that you referenced ethics and also future thinking, not just the tick in the box, as you said. So thank you for that. What I might do, we've got a couple of questions from the participants. I'll just put one up from Robert Prestopino has said, it's just moved now. The difference between systems and patterns. Would anyone like to address that from the panel? Thanks, Ray.
This is yours, really, Seanna, but anyhow, I'll pick it up. Well, there are people who refer to pattern thinking. I mean, you can think of systems in terms of a particular pattern of cause and effect, or a particular pattern of relationships. But the thing that I think distinguishes systems thinking from pattern thinking and network thinking is that it involves the distinction of a boundary and the focus on a particular set of relationships, and the idea that you can act purposefully to make some change for the better. And of course, that all systems are distinguished by someone, that there is a person or people involved. Whereas patterns may be seen to exist independently to some extent, although we all are discerners of patterns, so we can't really write ourselves out. Okay, is that good enough?
I'm sure you'll get a thumbs up in a minute from that. I'll go to another one now, and I'll probably add to it if I can, because there was some allusion to this before. For someone new to systems thinking, are there any books you would recommend? And I guess I just perhaps we'll go through the panel. We'll start with you, Ray. You're not on mute, and we'll go to Seanna and then Delia. I'd be interested in, and we can't all say Ray. That's the answer can't be Ray. Is not only a book that's influenced you, but who's been an influence, a great influence in the system space for you. So think of someone other than Ray, Seanna, and Delia. So just head up.
There's a little book here written by my very dear friend and close colleague, Rosalind Armstrong, based on work we did in the Open University to try and apply systems thinking to our own organisational circumstances. For my sins, I've always felt that one should walk one's talk. It hasn't always served me well, particularly in my own organisation, because internal work is often fraught with difficulty, more so than when you're brought in as an outside expert, so to speak. But Rosalind was an academic in our group at the Open University who was seconded to the senior team in the Open University to run a program called Persist, a combination of personnel and systems, and to help our then Vice Chancellor move towards and substantiate the claim that our university could be actually seen as a learning organisation. Imagine that, a university is a learning organisation. And Rosalind's book is called Growing Wings on the Way, Systems Thinking for Messy Situations. It's a delightful book.
Thank you, Ray. And a key influencer, and it can be the same person.
Well, naming a single person is rather invidious. I have a strand of influences from both systems and cybernetics. I think the person I will draw out is my partner, who, doing her PhD in the very complex issue of child sexual assault, drew on systemic family therapy to do her PhD, and I helped her by reading many draft chapters and learned a tremendous amount that way through from engaging with systemic family therapy, which I hadn't properly engaged with before.
Thank you, Ray. Much appreciated response. Thanks for that. Seanna, a book that people on the call can refer to, and perhaps an individual, if you're comfortable with that as well. That's been amazing.
Yeah. I wish I was sitting beside my bookshelf, actually, because it'd be so much easier. There's about 20 that I would pull off. But to add to Ray's, one that I reference quite a bit in addition to Rosalind's is Dave Stroh's book, which is Systems Thinking for Social Change. So oddly, it's not a practical applied book like I've been speaking about this evening, but I think it really helps to develop the mindset of what it means to work in this space, which is just as much about a personal systems practice as well. And just making sense of it in a way that the language is very accessible, which I find can not often be the case in systems resources. So that's one that I would point people to. I think for me, a really significant influence was Frances Wesley, a Canadian scholar in this space, who really, I think it was really about the time scale in terms of systems that she helped me to understand, and kind of movements of change, if you will. And in a practical sense, understanding how powerful process design is. And by that, I mean, what are the processes that we're designing in order to enable social learning to take place, which in my perspective is really the foundation that we need when we're doing systems thinking, because if we're appreciating and valuing diverse perspectives, we need processes that enable that to take place, for those diverse perspectives to come together, learn together, but also generate new knowledge that didn't previously exist. And it's a skill, it's a process, a capacity that I wasn't even aware of before I met her, and to me has really helped to make doing this work possible. So Frances Wesley is my influence, and Dave Stroh is my book reference.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the people posting in the chat. That's helping out for everyone as well for those things. Delia, a book and a person that's been influential for you.
Okay, so for me, it's been Stafford Beer. So Stafford Beer is a cybernetician with a viable systems model, and the book that really touched me was his Platform for Change, where as you go through the book, he's actually color-coded it to give, there's the black and white, which sort of like represents the, the hard, sort of like systems thinking, and it goes blue and then yellow as he goes through, and like illustrates the layers over a system and the way that we think. Just think it's, anyway, I still use it as a bit of a handbook, really. And a major influencer for me is our very own Dr. Anne Stevens in Australia. So And the reason why she's been influential was because I had so much difficulty understanding her work. But then once the penny dropped, I found it incredibly important, especially in this time. And that's Ecofeminism and Systems Thinking, which is published by Routledge. So I'm just going to show you on my phone like that. But, you know, for me, it really opened up. In systems literature, you won't find very much about gender. That I came across. It's taken me a long time to sort of like unravel that, but hers was the very first book and insight into that world. And I've got to say that it's very, very insightful, and I highly recommend that that book to sort of like get a different, you know, a different insight and application of systems thinking. So yes, those two. My big plugs.
Great, thank you so much, and hopefully that's enough for people to go and look up individuals and or buy some books that would help. I think, you know, especially this being our first Melbourne Hub event, being able to provide value back to the people that are on the call is a great thing that I'm focused on here. So thank you for that, and it's important to note, both from, I think from all three, but from Ray's and Delia's response specifically, the important application of systems thinking to, you know, what we might call wicked problems, you know, in terms of domestic violence or gender inequality and things like that. And you're right, there's not enough written about it, but certainly I think we're in a stage where there's becoming more focus on those things. I'll grab a couple of other questions. I'm conscious of time. We've got about 8 minutes left, and I do just want to round out with the presenters at the end, just giving a bit of a summary of how people might contact them, or something that they might want to share from their own perspectives, whether it's a book or education or research that you're working on. I have a question about how can I enhance my ability to adopt the system thinking, and what should I do to advance my level at sense making as well? I'm new to this, thank you. So I guess perhaps we've partly answered that through some of the references to the books, but is there any guidance that any of you might have on how someone new to the field might get better at thinking about systems?
Do a module with Seanna as soon as you can.
Thanks, Ray. I'm going to share a link in the chat now. I'm just pulling up the page. Folks, I think, will probably notice the common theme through my statements tonight, but when folks ask me where to start, I say to start small, and to dedicate some space and time, like literally weekly, even if it's about 15 minutes. It's like trying to build a meditation practice, you know? And sometimes I think to myself, oh, I think often about meditating, but I don't actually do it. So that doesn't count. We have to actually practice these things. And so the link that I've shared in the chat is a series of systems practices that I created with a colleague, Michelle Morgan. These were, you know, not only of our own creation, a lot of systems habits, practices, they've been around in the field for a very long time. What we tried to do was to introduce a very specific reflective prompt that goes with 10 of the common system habits or practices that we would encourage folks to start with. And so what I suggest to others is to print this out, stick it beside your computer, and when you are feeling stuck or unclear or things are really ambiguous, it is more than likely that at least one of these practices, if you just scan through the list, is going to feel like it's going to kind of be able to get you through the hump. And so to just literally take 10 minutes and sit with one of these reflective practices. And the thing is that doing this is not hard. It's what you do with the answer. So everything that we're trying to do in systems is be adaptive, be responsive to the system as it emerges. And so when you land on a response to this reflective question, it's about how are you now going to use that information to adapt your proposed actions, ways of thinking, or being in the system. And that truly, fundamentally, in my opinion, is the best way that you can build your systemic capabilities, as Ray would call them.
Thanks, Sean. And perhaps, and I'll go to the other two in a sec, just to close out the session. I'm just conscious I do want to finish on time, just being respectful of everyone joining us. So as Ray said, so Seanna, you got the systems school. Is there? We'll share links with people after this as well through the Systems Innovation Network. But where can people find more about that, Seanna, from yourself?
I'll drop a link in the chat as well. So I run an Introductions to Systems Thinking course. There's one just underway right now, as well as a Methods for Systems Change, which is using our systems change framework, teaching you methods that align with each element of the framework. We've also got a course coming up shortly about power in the system, which is one that's often very present for folks starting in June. I'll share a link. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Delia, I'll just hand over to you just to close out from your perspective as well, and perhaps share the ISSS work that you're working on and how people might get access to that and what they might get from the ISSS.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I just want to say, yes, we need system literacy. So go for Seanna's course, and also Ray Ison also does a course as well. ISSS is definitely a place to visit. We have conversations, and I think if you really, in terms of learning about systems thinking, systems science, it's about coming into the conversation. And at the ISSS, we have Monday evening conversations that come in from the ISSS. Here in Australia, we have the Australian, New Zealand, and South African group. And if you're interested in that conversation, please get in contact with either myself or Ray. And then we also have the social media sites as well. So on Facebook, we have a thriving community there of people where if we go to the International Society for System Sciences page, we can actually show you which groups to join. And that's where you can really connect with other systems thinkers and practitioners who are continually sharing so much information across a broad spectrum of topics, from education to ecology to maths to to the whole thing. So feel free to feel free to join those groups and connect with people there, and then you'll definitely find a wealth of places to visit. And of course, coming back to the Systems Innovation Group, here is also a very good place as well. So thank you very much, Imre and Joss.
Thank you, Delia. And yes, it was Anne Stevens that actually recommended me to ISSS, and I've recently joined, so I'll definitely be engaging in some capacity. So thanks for that. And finally, Ray, I'll just hand over to you in closing in terms of how people can reach out to you or what you would recommend from your perspective.
Thanks very much, Imre. Thank you, Joss, for the invitation to be here this evening as well. And good luck to all of you with taking some of these ideas back into your own lives. There's been some questions about worldview and constraints and how we do this quick enough. And the only way we can do this quick enough is for you to begin doing it yourself. But don't do it alone. Reach out to others, create a reading group, create a book club around systems ideas, create a community of practice. These are all ideas that you can begin to do and reach out beyond the silos of your own organization. Above all else, be aware of whether you can actually think relationally and systemically. if I had more time and in a face-to-face event, I'd ask you to do a little exercise about and ask the question, how does walking happen as a relational practice? And most people answer that question with some sort of causal answer. They fail to give an answer which says walking happens in the relational dynamics between a person and a medium such as the floor. And if you remove the relational dynamics between the two, walking as a practice doesn't happen. So we are really constrained to be able to think and act relationally because we are still stuck in so much cause and effect thinking. So foster conversations about how and invent new institutions that can begin to put these ideas into practice. And above all else, if you're in an organisation, think about the rules of the organisational game, the governance of your organisation, the governance of your project, and think about the governance of our societies. The pandemic has displayed only too well how we failed so many people and how our governance systems are, by and large, very flaky.
Thank you very much. Just in closing, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Joss, who's organising this globally and has helped me in establishing the Melbourne hub. I'd like to thank all the people that participated, registered and come on board. And I know we didn't get to all of your questions, but you can certainly follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on the Systems Innovation Network website, and you can engage further that way if we haven't answered or addressed any specific things. You know, the three panelists, you can connect through LinkedIn with them, I suspect. They won't have a problem with that. And thanks also to Joss for helping in the on the chat room so that I didn't have to do all the posting and watching all the questions. It's a big help for me. So just thanks very much to everyone, but most importantly, thanks to Ray, Seanna and Delia for giving of their time and their insights and perspectives on systems thinking. It's been a real pleasure for me to be able to host this and to meet you virtually, and look forward to learning from you in whatever ways we can find through your organisations and your research and writings.